On the morning of her 22nd birthday, the state of Minnesota handed Nora Voss a rusty iron key, a deed to land she had never seen, and a look that said, "We are done with you." The man across the desk, Harlan Pruitt Alderman of Flint County, his suit pressed sharp as a verdict, slid the papers toward her with 2 fingers, the way you might push something unpleasant to the edge of a table before sweeping it into the trash. He told her the property was worthless, a ruin, a collapsed stone structure on a ridge so exposed and so remote that even the county maps had stopped bothering with it. What he did not tell her was that he had been waiting for this moment for 15 years. What she did not know was that the man who left her that land, a man she had never met, an uncle named Silas Voss, who had lived and died alone on that frozen ridge, had spent those same 15 years making sure she would survive what was coming. The key was cold in her palm. Outside, the October sky over Flint County had already begun to turn the color of a bruise. She had no money, no plan, and no one. What she had was a key, a deed, and somewhere above the tree line, a ruin that a dead man had spent a lifetime building into something that would outlast them all. She just didn't know it yet. Cold ground, deep roots. Part 1. The Key and the Ruin. On the morning of her 22nd birthday, the state of Minnesota gave Nora Voss 3 things: a rusty iron key, a deed to land she had never seen, and a look from Harlan Pruitt that said more clearly than any words could that she was no longer anyone's problem. She had been someone's problem for exactly 15 years. Since the night a county social worker had lifted her from the back seat of a car parked outside a gas station in Duluth. A 7-year-old girl with no shoes and no explanation, and carried her into a system that would spend the next decade and a half moving her from one temporary place to the next. Foster homes that smelled of cigarettes and resignation. Group facilities with fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects, and rules posted on laminated cards above every door. She had learned early that the cardinal sin in those places was wanting too much, wanting a family, wanting to stay, wanting anything that could be taken from you, because it would be. She had stopped wanting at around age 12, or she had learned to want quietly in ways that didn't show. Now she sat in the hard wooden chair across from Harlan Pruitt's desk in the Flint County Administrative Building, and she watched him slide the papers toward her with 2 fingers, the way a man might push a plate of food he found unappetizing to the far edge of a table. Pruitt was 55 years old and looked like a man who had spent every one of those years being right about things. His face was broad and weathered, the face of someone who had grown up working and then decided at some point that other people should do the working while he watched. His suit was pressed with the kind of precision that announced itself. His desk was clean in the way that powerful men's desks are always clean because someone else handles the mess. He had the papers waiting for her when she arrived. He had not offered her coffee. He had not offered her anything except the seat and the transaction. The deed was for a piece of land in the northern part of the county, a place the document called the Cold Hollow Ridge property. 41 acres. A collapsed structure of indeterminate value. No road access to speak of. Last assessed at a figure that would not have bought a decent used truck. Her great-uncle one Silas Voss had died in April of that year at the age of 64. He had lived on that land alone for the better part of 3 decades. He had no other living relatives on record. He had no debts, no bank accounts, no outstanding obligations to the county or anyone else. He had simply lived up there on that ridge and then stopped living, and the land had to go somewhere. It went to her. Pruitt explained all of this in the tone of a man reading from a manual he had long since memorized. And when he finished, he folded his hands on the desk and looked at her with an expression that was almost sympathetic in the way that a closing door is almost an invitation. He asked her if she had any questions. She asked him if the structure on the property was livable. He said, "I wouldn't know. I haven't been up there in years. Nobody has." He paused then, and something moved behind his eyes. It was there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He said, "You're not planning to live there, are you?" She told him she didn't have a lot of options. He nodded slowly, and then he asked in a tone that had shifted almost imperceptibly whether she had given any thought to selling. There were buyers for land in that part of the county, he said. Even rough land. Even land like that. She wouldn't get much, but she'd get something, and something was better than trying to survive a Minnesota winter in a structure that had been collapsing for 30 years. She looked at him. He was watching her with an attention that felt disproportionate to the situation. Too focused, too still. Like a man who has placed a bet and is watching the wheels spin. She told him she would think about it. She took the key and the deed, and she left. The hallway outside Pruitt's office was long and dim-floored with the kind of institutional tile that had been the backdrop of most of her childhood. She was halfway down it, the key cold in her fist, when she heard his office door open behind her. She did not turn around. She slowed her pace and she listened. His voice was low, but not low enough. She heard him say into a phone 7 words. "The girl picked up the papers today." A pause. She doesn't have anywhere else to go. Another pause, longer this time. Then quieter, almost to himself, the way a man speaks when he believes he is alone. "She won't make it past the first snow." She kept walking. She did not let herself react until she was through the glass doors and out into the cold October air, and even then, she only stopped for a moment, standing on the concrete steps, with the wind coming down off the hills, feeling the key in her hand and thinking. He had been waiting for this moment. She did not yet know what that meant, but she understood with the instinct of someone who had spent 15 years learning to read rooms and people and the quality of silences that it meant something. That Harlan Pruitt's interest in a 41-acre piece of rough land with a collapsed building on it was not the casual concern of a county official doing his job. He wanted the land, and he was certain she would fail. She shouldered her bag and walked to the bus station. The bus that served the northern part of Flint County ran twice a day and stopped at a crossroads junction 6 miles from the base of Cold Hollow Ridge. The driver, a heavy-set man with no interest in conversation, told her the road up to the ridge was not maintained by the county and had not been for years. He said this without looking at her, in the flat tone of a man delivering information he assumed would be acted upon. She thanked him. He said, "You getting off at Hannigan's Junction?" She said yes. He said nothing more. The bus moved through the county on roads that got progressively quieter, progressively less certain of themselves. The towns thinned out and then disappeared, replaced by stretches of farmland going brown with the season, and then tree lines, and then hills. The sky was the color of old pewter. The birches along the road had gone bare and stood against that sky like cracks in pale plaster. There were 4 other passengers when she boarded. There was one when the bus reached Hannigan's Junction. She stepped off into a silence so complete it had texture. The bus pulled away and the sound of its engine faded, and the silence settled back in around her, like water filling a depression in sand. The wind was steady and cold, and carried the smell of pine and something mineral, something deep, the smell of ground that had not seen warmth in a long time and was not expecting it soon. The road north was a rutted track through second-growth timber. The county road sign at the junction had been knocked sideways at some point, and nobody had straightened it. She adjusted the straps on her bag and started walking. It took her the better part of 2 hours to reach the base of the ridge. The trail up was steeper than she expected, switchbacking up through rock outcroppings and stands of white spruce that grew close and dark, their lower branches dead and skeletal. The ground was hard and uneven, and in places the trail disappeared entirely into beds of pine needles and loose stone, only to reappear 15 feet higher. She climbed with her head down and her hands occasionally touching the ground for balance, not thinking about the top, only about the next step. When she reached the summit, the light was already going gray with late afternoon. She stopped and looked at what she had inherited. The structure had been built into the hillside itself, a dugout design that had used the ridge as both foundation and rear wall. What remained standing was a single stone chimney, thick and square, built from field stone, with a precision that time had not fully degraded. The rest was collapse. The front wall had come down in sections, the stones scattered and partially buried in the earth that had reclaimed them. The roof had fallen inward, the timber beams rotted through, and what remained of the rafters jutted up from the debris at broken angles, silvered and smooth from decades of weather. The surrounding ground was thick with the remains of what had once been an attempt at order, terraced areas now invisible under encroaching brush. The ghost of a drainage channel running along the north side of the structure. It was not a ruin. That word implied something that had once been grand. This was a wound in the hillside that had healed badly. She stood at the edge of it for a long time. The wind on the ridge was different from the wind in the valley. It had a voice up here, a low, unceasing moan that moved around the chimney and through the broken timbers and across the exposed stone like something searching. The sky above was moving fast clouds pushing south, and the temperature was dropping with the light. She found a section of intact wall on the south side, where the hillside itself created a natural windbreak, and she settled against it with her bag and her thin blanket, and she ate the bread and dried meat she had brought. And she looked at the chimney, and she thought about the man who had built it. Silas Voss. She had known nothing about him until 3 weeks ago, when a letter had arrived at the group home addressed to her in a handwriting she did not recognize. The letter had been from a county attorney, brief and procedural, informing her that she had been named the sole heir of her great-uncle's estate. She had not known she had a great-uncle. She had not known she had any family at all beyond the absence of one, which was the only shape family had ever taken in her life. She had asked the home administrator if there was any other information. He had checked the file. There was a name, Silas Voss, and a county of residence, and nothing else. No photographs, no letters, no record of contact. She had gone to the county records office and looked him up. He had owned the Cold Hollow Ridge property since 1968. He had paid his property taxes every year without fail in cash through a post office box in the town of Granger, 12 miles from the junction. He had no driver's license on file, no vehicle registration, no phone listing. He had to all appearances lived 40 years on that ridge without leaving a trace in any system that tracked human beings, which was a kind of achievement she understood better than most. She slept badly that first night cold despite the wall, and woke before dawn to a frost that had silvered every surface, and a sky that had cleared to a hard, starless dark. She ate the last of the bread. She sat with her back against the cold stone and watched the sky lighten by degrees over the eastern hills, the color moving from black to a deep gray blue. That was not quite promise and not quite despair, but something in between, which was where she had spent most of her life anyway. She stayed that first day and the second and the third without doing much of anything. This was not a choice exactly. It was more like a system shut down. The kind that happens after too long running on too little, when the body and the mind reach a silent agreement to stop forward motion for a while and simply process what has accumulated. She had nothing. She had 41 acres of damaged earth and a chimney and a key that fit no lock she could find. She had approximately $90 in her pocket, which was the remainder of what the county had given her. She had no car, no phone, no contacts in Flint County or anywhere else. She had one change of clothes and a blanket that was not equal to the temperature. The logical conclusion was visible from where she sat. If she stayed, she would exhaust her food in a few more days, and then begin to suffer in earnest as the cold deepened. If she left, she would return to the world on the valley floor, with nothing but the deed to a piece of land a county official wanted to buy for reasons she didn't yet understand. On the morning of the fourth day, she noticed the thistle. It was growing from a crack in a collapsed section of the front wall, in a place where a massive lintel stone had fallen and broken and left a gap that had slowly over many years accumulated enough wind-blown soil to support life. The plant was not large. Its leaves were spined and dark green and still holding their color against the frost. And at its center was a flower head, gone to seed, the purple, mostly faded, but still present. Still there, a flag that had refused to come down. She looked at it for a long time. It had no business being there. The conditions were wrong in every measurable way. The soil was thin and poor and contaminated with lime from the mortared stone. The wind scoured the wall face daily. The frost hit it every night. It was there anyway. Something shifted in her chest. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories where the revelation arrives like a door blown open by wind. It was smaller than that. It was the almost imperceptible change in the quality of a material when it reaches the temperature at which it stops bending and begins to hold its shape. She put her hand on the cold stone and pushed herself to her feet. She began with the debris nearest the entrance to what had clearly been a subterranean portion of the structure, the section built directly into the hillside. The collapse here was deep layers of fallen roof material over fallen wall sections over years of accumulated earth and vegetation. But beneath all of it, the hillside itself remained, and the hillside did not collapse. She moved stone by hand. There was no other way to do it. Each piece had to be lifted and carried and placed, and the larger ones had to be rolled or levered, and some of them she could not move at all and had to work around. Her palms split on the rough edges and bled, and she packed the cuts with strips torn from her second shirt and kept working. She did not think about the future. She thought about the stone in her hands. On the second day of clearing, she found it. She almost missed it. Her fingers searching along the base of what had been the back wall of the structure, the wall that was the hillside itself, found not earth or stone, but the edge of something different, smoother, deliberate. She dug around it with her hands, and then with a flat piece of stone that served as a crude trowel, working carefully now the way you work when you sense you are close to something. What emerged from the earth was a heavy iron box, perhaps 12 inches long and 8 wide, wrapped in a sleeve of oilskin that had largely rotted away, but had done its job, had preserved the interior from moisture for long enough. The box had been set into a cavity in the base of the chimney structure, hidden in plain sight in the one part of the building that could be guaranteed to outlast everything else. The lid was rusted shut. She worked at it with a piece of flat iron she'd pulled from the debris, using it as a pry bar, applying slow, steady pressure until the rust gave way with a sound like a quiet word spoken in an empty room, and the lid came open. Inside, wrapped in what had once been felt and was now mostly a compressed gray powder, was a book. It was thick, bound in leather that had darkened with age, but held its integrity, the cover warped slightly from decades of temperature variation, but intact. She lifted it out with the care of someone handling something she did not yet understand, but already suspected mattered. She opened it. The first page was not a title. It was not a table of contents or an index or any of the technical apparatus she might have expected. It was a letter, written in a small, precise hand in ink that had faded to the color of rust, but remained fully legible. It began with 2 words that she read 3 times before she understood them. Dear Nora. She sat down in the cold rubble with the book in her lap, and she read. He had known her name. He had known where she was. He had known everything. Silas Voss wrote that he had learned of her existence in 1993 when she was 7 years old and newly entered into the state's care system through a connection he did not fully explain, except to say that someone in the county system had owed him a debt and had paid it in information. He had made inquiries. He had established certain facts. He had decided after long deliberation not to come for her. He wrote about that decision with the plain, unflinching honesty of a man who had made peace with something that had cost him greatly. He could not protect her and the land both, he wrote. Harlan Pruitt was watching him. Had been watching him since 1978, since the winter that everything had changed. If Pruitt had known about Nora, she would have become leverage. She would have become a pressure point, a way to force Silas's hand. Her invisibility was her safety, and her safety was more important than his need to know her. But invisible did not mean unprotected. He had quietly, through channels that would not be traced back to him, intervened 3 times in 15 years when the system had threatened to move her far enough away that he would lose track of her. He did not specify how. He wrote only that there were still people in this county who remembered what the winter of 1978 had actually been, and who were willing to do small, careful things when asked. He had watched her from a distance. That was the length of his regret grow into someone he described with a restraint that made the words heavier than sentiment, could have capable, self-contained, and completely unaware of what she carries. He had been diagnosed in January of that year. He had written the letter in February. He had died in April, alone on the ridge in the house that had kept him alive through every hard winter for 37 years. He had left her everything he knew. She did not cry. That capacity had been used up a long time ago, or at least redistributed, channeled into other functions. She felt instead a low resonant ache, the kind that occupies the chest cavity rather than the eyes, and she sat with it for a while in the cold and the quiet, and then she turned to the second page. The second page was a diagram. The rest of the book was the manual.
Silas Voss had been by training and by temperament an engineer. He had studied thermodynamics at a state college in the late 1960s, before life had redirected him north and upward to this ridge, and he had brought that training with him and applied it obsessively to the problem of surviving in one of the harshest climates in the continental United States, with minimal resources and no external support.
The journal ran to nearly 200 pages. It covered the geological composition of the ridge in precise detail, noting the locations of specific stone deposits, the drainage patterns of the hillside, the thermal behavior of the soil at various depths. It contained hand-drawn surveys of the property with measurements she could replicate. It included the complete design specifications for a heating system, unlike anything she had ever seen, described a massive masonry structure of soapstone and fireclay that he called by the German term for its type a Kachelofen, a heat retention stove designed to burn a small, very hot fire for a short period and then radiate that stored heat slowly, evenly, and continuously for many hours afterward. The soapstone absorbed heat at a rate that cast iron could not approach. The thermal mass of the completed structure, which would weigh several tons, would hold enough energy from a 2-hour fire to warm the enclosed dugout space for the better part of a day. The subterranean walls of the dugout itself would buffer against the wildest temperature swings maintained at a stable intermediate temperature by the earth surrounding them on 3 sides. He had marked the location of the soapstone deposit on the property map. He had marked the clay deposit along the frozen creek bed. He had noted the grade of aggregate available from the ridge's own exposed rock faces. He had left her everything she needed to build what he had built. Not just the structure, the understanding, the philosophy behind it. In a passage near the front of the technical section before the diagrams and specifications began, he had written, "The common instinct in cold country is to fight the cold directly. Bigger fires, more fuel, brute opposition. That instinct will kill you when resources run short, and resources always run short. The better question is not how to defeat the cold, but how to preserve the warmth you have. Stone does not heat quickly. Stone does not cool quickly either. Stone remembers." She read until the light was gone and she could no longer make out the words. Then she sat in the dark with the book in her lap, and the wind moving around the chimney above her. And she thought about Harlan Pruitt, who had been waiting 15 years for her to fail. And she thought about Silas Voss, who had spent 37 years on this ridge building her a way to survive. One of them
had underestimated her. She was going to need supplies. She descended the ridge the next morning in the early gray light, following the track down through the timber to the county road, and walked the 6 miles to the town of Granger in just under 2 hours. Granger was not much a grain elevator, a diner that appeared to be open a post office, a Methodist church with a notice board and a general store whose hand-painted sign read Brennan's Supply, and whose front porch held a row of propane tanks and a stack of bagged concrete mix that told her what she needed to know about the proprietor's understanding of his customers' needs. Inside the store was the kind of place that smelled permanently of sawdust machine oil and the particular variety of ground coffee that comes from a percolator that has been running since before anyone currently alive can remember. The shelves were well organized and deep. Behind the long wooden counter stood a man who looked like he had been standing there since approximately the time the store was built. He was perhaps 58 thick through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had been arranged by weather and time into an expression of permanent, non-hostile assessment. He watched her approach the counter with eyes that moved over her details quickly and without theatricality, cataloging what they found: the dirt under her nails, the cuts on her palms wrapped in cloth, the specific quality of steadiness in someone who has been through something recent and has not yet fully processed it. His name, she would learn, was Wendell Cray. She put her list on the counter. Portland cement, 2 bags, a steel pry bar, a pointed shovel with a good handle, a flat spade, work gloves, heavy gauge, food provisions for 2 weeks, practical, calorie dense, and a question: did he know of anyone with a wagon or a truck who made regular runs toward the North Ridge roads? He read the list from the top without picking it up. When he reached the end, he looked at her. "You're up at the Voss property," he said. It was not a question. She said yes. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's a hard piece of ground." "I know." Winter's already started up there. Another 3 weeks, maybe less, before the first real snow. "I know that too." He looked at her hands, at the cloth wrapped around her palms. "You're building something," he said. "A stove," she said. "Masonry. It's going to take time." He absorbed this. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted slightly, like a weight redistributing. He did not ask her why. He did not tell her it was foolish. He did not offer advice she had not asked for. He said, "I run a supply wagon up the North Roads on Tuesdays. I can take what you need as far as the Hannigan Junction and cache it there. You'd have to carry it the last 6 miles." She said that was fine. He named a fair price and told her she could pay the balance when she had it. She paid what she had immediately and wrote down what she owed. She was picking up the provisions from the counter when the door opened behind her, bringing cold air and the particular quality of entrance that announces someone who expects a room to rearrange itself around them. Harlan Pruitt walked into Brennan's Supply in his pressed coat and his assured stride, and he stopped when he saw her at the counter, as though the sight of her required a moment of recalibration. Then he smiled. It was the smile of a man who has calculated odds and found them comfortable.
"Well,"
he said. He moved to the counter with his hands in his coat pockets, unhurried, confident.
"I didn't expect you back down so soon. I thought perhaps you'd decided to make a go of it up there."
He looked at the supplies on the counter, at the pry bar, at the bags of cement. His eyebrows moved in what was clearly a performance of amusement.
"A stove,"
he said, and it was obvious he had heard. The store was not large.
"You're going to build a stove in a pile of rubble and call it a home."
He was performing for the room. Wendell Cray watched from behind the counter without expression. There were two other customers at the far end of the store, and they had both gone still, in the way that people go still when they are listening without wanting to appear to be listening. Nora looked at Pruitt. She had been looked at by men like him before. Men who used the air in a room like a tool, who filled it with their certainty and watched others contract around it. She had learned in 15 years of institutions that the correct response to that kind of pressure was not resistance, which required energy she preferred to conserve, and not submission, which cost too much of something less measurable. The correct response was stillness. She held his gaze and said nothing and waited. He found that he needed to fill the silence himself.
"The Voss land is not kind to people who don't know what they're doing,"
he said, his tone shifting slightly, not warming, but becoming more expansive, almost paternal.
"That old man spent 30 years up there and managed it because he had certain knowledge, certain experience. You're a young woman who's never spent a winter outside a heated building. The ridge will kill you quietly and efficiently before February, and the county will end up with the property anyway, which means all of this is a delay at best." He paused. "I'm trying to save you some suffering."
"Are you?" she said. The two words came out flat and even, not hostile, just level, like a surface that offers nothing to grip. Something moved behind Pruitt's eyes. Not quite irritation. More like the slight recalibration of a man who had expected a different response from the material he was applying pressure to. He said, "My offer stands. Fair market value more than fair given the condition of the property. You'd have enough to start properly somewhere warm." She picked up the pry bar from the counter and put it in her bag. "Thank you for the advice," she said. She walked out. Behind her, she heard Pruitt exhale through his nose in a short, compressed sound that told her everything she needed to know about how the encounter had landed with him. She heard Wendell Cray say in his flat, unhurried voice, "You need anything, Harlan?" And she heard Pruitt's footsteps move toward the back of the store. She walked out into the cold air, and she kept walking. She did not let herself think about Pruitt until she was a mile up the county road, until the town was behind her and the tree line had closed around the track, and the only sound was the wind in the spruce crowns and her own footsteps on the frozen ground. Then she thought about him. He had been waiting for this moment for 15 years. That was what she'd heard him say on the phone or close enough to it. He wanted the land. He was certain she would fail. And he was not a man who left things to chance, which meant his certainty was based on something more than observation. He had done something. She did not know yet what it was, but she knew the shape of it, the way you know the shape of something in the dark, by what your hands find when they reach out. There was a gap in the story, a piece that wasn't there, something that explained why Silas Voss had lived alone on a ridge for 37 years. Why he had gone to the lengths he had to remain invisible. Why he had written the name Harlan Pruitt in that letter with the particular weight of a man naming his wound. She needed to know what had happened in 1978. She was halfway up the ridge when she remembered the old woman from the store. Wendell Cray had not introduced her, and the woman had not introduced herself, and she had said nothing during the entire encounter with Pruitt. But she had been watching, and the quality of her watching had been different from the other customers, different even from Wendell Cray's watching. It had been the watching of someone who knew the specific shape of what they were looking at. Nora had filed it away without knowing she had. Now she retrieved it. The woman had been perhaps 70 years old with white hair cut practically short, and a face that carried its age without concealment. The kind of face that had stopped caring about appearances sometime in the previous decade, and was the better for it. She had been sitting at the small table near the store's front window, with a cup of coffee she was not drinking, and she had looked at Nora with the specific expression of someone who recognizes a person they have only previously known as a name. She reached the summit as the light was fading to the flat gray of early evening. She stood at the edge of the ruins and she looked at the chimney standing against the moving sky, and she felt the cold coming down off the north, and she thought about the journal in her bag and the diagram on the second page. She had perhaps 3 weeks before the first serious snow. She lit a small fire from the wood she had scavenged, and she opened the journal to the section on materials. And she read by firelight until she could not keep her eyes open. Somewhere in the middle of the night, she woke to a sound she could not immediately identify, a low, persistent creaking from somewhere in the debris above her position, rhythmic and slow. She lay still and listened, and understood after a moment that it was one of the remaining roof timbers shifting in the wind, talking to itself in the language of old wood. She lay in the dark and thought about Silas Voss, who had listened to this sound for 37 years, who had woken in this cold and this dark, and chosen every morning to stay. She thought about the letter and the 15 years of quiet intervention and the word he had used. Capable. She thought about Pruitt on the phone. She won't make it past the first snow. She thought about the thistle still holding its color against the frost. She reached into her bag and her hand found the iron key. Still cold, still solid. The one piece of this she had carried from the beginning, from that desk in the county building, from the look on Pruitt's face when he slid the papers toward her. It had fit no lock she had found in the rubble.
She had been assuming it was a metaphor. She was beginning to think it was something more literal. She turned it in her fingers in the dark, reading it by touch, the weight of it, the particular cut of its bow, and she thought there is a lock somewhere. Something Silas locked and did not describe in the letter, because the letter was for her to read in an emergency, quickly under duress. Something that required her to be present, to be here, to have survived long enough to look. She put the key back in her bag and closed her eyes and let the wind move around the chimney above her, and she slept. In the morning, she would begin to build. 3 weeks before the first snow. 3 weeks to quarry stone and mix clay and raise a structure that a skilled engineer had taken months to construct. She would not take months. She did not have months. She had the journal and the key and the knowledge that somewhere below her, in a pressed suit, a man was waiting for her to fail. She had the thistle. She had the cold ground under her back and the deep roots of something she did not yet have a name for, but could feel the way you feel the temperature of a room change before your body registers it consciously. A slow and certain gathering of warmth in the very center of a thing that had been cold for a very long time. She would begin in the morning. Cold ground, deep roots, Part 2. Stone by stone. The soapstone deposit was exactly where Silas Voss had marked it. She found it on the second morning following the property map from the journal, with the care of someone reading directions in an unfamiliar language, checking landmarks against the hand-drawn notations. A specific rock formation shaped like a thumb, a dry creek bed running northeast, a stand of tamarack that Silas had marked with an X, and the note the trees know where the water runs underground. Follow them. She followed them. The outcropping appeared at the base of a north-facing ledge where the ridge dropped sharply before leveling into a narrow shelf of land. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that announced itself. It was a gray-green face of layered rock exposed by some long-ago movement of the hillside. Its surface plated and flat, the layers separating naturally along horizontal lines, the way pages separate in a book that has been left in the rain. She put her hand against it and felt the cold smoothness of it and understood immediately why Silas had chosen it. Soapstone had a particular quality under the hand. Dense and slightly waxy, with the deep internal heaviness of something that has been compressed over a very long time into something that will not easily yield. It would hold heat. It would hold it long after any fire died. She drove the pry bar into the first natural seam and leaned her weight onto it, and the stone cracked along its bedding plane with a sound like a clean break, like something that had been waiting for permission. The piece that came free was roughly 18 inches across and perhaps 3 inches thick, and it weighed more than she expected, considerably more, and when she lifted it, she felt the weight go into her lower back immediately, and she adjusted her stance and distributed it differently and stood there for a moment, breathing. Then she put it down and went back for the next piece, She worked the deposit for 3 full days. There was no efficient way to do it. The pry bar and the flat spade were her only tools, and the stone cooperated only on its own terms, fracturing cleanly in some places and stubbornly in others, occasionally releasing pieces of the size she needed, and occasionally releasing pieces that were too large to carry or too small to be useful. She developed a feel for it. The way you develop a feel for anything after sufficient repetitive contact, not knowledge exactly, but a kind of conversation between her hands and the material, a slow negotiation over what was possible. The carrying was the harder problem. Silas's journal had addressed this. In a section near the back of the materials chapter, written in the slightly more compressed hand of someone recording practical notes rather than reflective thought, he had described building a stone boat, not a water vessel, but a low flat sledge. 2 heavy planks joined by cross braces with a curved lip at the front to help it ride over obstacles rather than catching on them. You loaded the stone onto it and dragged it. On rough ground, it was brutally hard work. On snow, it would have been almost manageable. In October, on frozen but still snow-free ground, it was somewhere between the two. She built the sledge from timber she salvaged from the collapsed roof structure, using the pry bar to free the straightest sections and the flat spade as a rough plane to remove the worst of the rot from the surfaces. She lashed the joints with paracord from her bag. It was not elegant. It held. She loaded it with stone, and she pulled. The first load covered 60 yards in 40 minutes. Her shoulders burned in a way she had not previously understood shoulders could burn. The muscles across her upper back, the ones that connected the shoulder blades to the spine, informed her in terms she could not ignore that they had not been consulted about this project and were registering their objection. She stopped and stretched and drank water and ate a strip of dried meat and pulled. By the end of the 3rd day, she had moved enough soapstone to the worksite to begin construction of the firebox and the lower thermal mass. Her hands had passed through the blister stage and arrived at the other side, the stage where the skin, having lost its softness and its sensitivity and its pretensions to being anything other than a working surface, had simply hardened into something more functional. The palms were rough now. The fingers had lost their city softness. She looked at them one evening in the last light and barely recognized them as her own, which felt less like loss than like introduction. She was becoming someone she had not previously met. The fire clay deposit was where the journal said it would be, in a cut bank along the dry creek bed 300 yards west of the main work site. She dug it with the flat spade, working in sections, piling it into the 5-gallon buckets that Wendell Cray had included in the Tuesday supply drop at Hannigan Junction, and she carried it back in loads 2 buckets at a time, the handles cutting into her palms despite the gloves. The clay had to be tested before use. Silas had written careful instructions, a small test sample mixed with aggregate and formed into a cylinder, dried slowly, then fired briefly in a small open flame, then checked for cracking. If it cracked too much clay in the mix. If it crumbled, not enough. She ran the test 3 times until she understood the proportion by feel
rather than by measurement, the point at which the mixed material had the specific plasticity of something that would hold its shape through the firing process. She began laying the foundation of the firebox on the 8th day. The design was not complicated in principle. It was complicated in execution. The kakalophan that Silas had described and diagrammed was a system of internal passages, a labyrinth of flues designed to capture the heat from the combustion gases as they moved through the structure before exiting the chimney. The gases entered hot at the firebox, then traveled a long, convoluted path through the soapstone mass, giving up their energy to the stone along the way, arriving at the chimney exit largely spent of the heat they had carried. That heat was now in the stone. The stone would release it slowly for hours at a temperature safe to touch and steady enough to warm the enclosed space without fluctuation. The intelligence of it she understood more deeply with every course of stone she laid, was not in any single element, but in the relationship between them. The firebox had to be sized precisely relative to the flue passages. The flue passages had to be sized relative to the total thermal mass. The thermal mass had to be sized relative to the volume of the space being heated. Change one variable without adjusting the others, and the system degraded in proportion to the error. Silas had done those calculations once. She was following his results. But following precise instructions with imprecise tools and materials of variable quality required a constant series of small adjustments. And each adjustment required her to understand not just the instruction, but the principle behind it, so that she could modify correctly rather than randomly. She read the journal every evening by firelight until she had internalized the logic of the system as completely as she had internalized the feel of the clay. She did not think about Pruitt. She thought about the next course of stone, the angle of the next flue passage, the consistency of the next batch of mortar. She was not avoiding Pruitt. She was practicing a discipline she had learned early in places where thinking too far ahead was a way to make the present moment unbearable. She would handle Pruitt when the time came. Right now, the time was stone. On the 11th day, Ada Coombs came up the hill. Nora heard her before she saw her. The specific sound of footsteps that belonged to someone older navigating the upper section of the trail, deliberate and unhurried, with the careful weight distribution of someone who had done this before and had learned not to hurry it. She kept working and listened to the footsteps get closer, and when they stopped, she looked up. Ada Coombs was 70 years old and built like someone who had spent those years doing things. Not large, but dense, the compactness of a person who had never carried unnecessary weight in any sense. Her hair was white and cut close, and she wore a heavy canvas coat that had been mended in at least 3 places with different colored thread, which suggested either an indifference to matching or a preference for utility over appearance. And these were the same thing. She carried a cloth bag over one arm. She stood at the edge of the work site and looked at what Nora had done with an expression that was not surprise. It was recognition. She had come expecting to find something specific, and she was finding it. She put the cloth bag down on a flat stone and said, "I knew your uncle." Nora sat back on her heels. Her hands were gray with clay.
"I know,"
she said.
Ada looked at her. "He wrote about you," Nora said. "Not by name, but he mentioned there was someone who knew him before." She paused. "Before Pruitt?" Ada was quiet for a moment. She looked at the rising structure of the stove, at the clean lines of laid soapstone at the mortar joints, packed with the precision of someone who had read the instructions carefully. Then she sat down on the flat stone next to her bag, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked out over the valley below, and she began to talk.
She talked for a long time.
The winter of 1978 had been the second worst cold event in Flint County's recorded history. A multi-day blizzard that arrived in January and stayed for 6 days, depositing more than 4 feet of snow across the region and driving temperatures to numbers that made the cold not a weather condition, but a lethal force. The county road system collapsed within the first 12 hours. Power lines came down. Families in the outlying areas, the ones too far from town to make it in before the roads closed, were cut off completely. Silas Voss had been 34 years old. He had been living on Cold Hollow Ridge for 7 years at that point, long enough to have built the first version of the Cachalofen, long enough to have learned the ridge's patterns and moods and what it demanded of the people who chose to inhabit it. When the blizzard sealed the valley, he went down into it. Not immediately, not while the snow was still flying and the visibility was nothing. He waited for the second day when the wind dropped briefly, and he went down through chest-deep drifts on snowshoes he had built himself, following the roads by memory and instinct rather than sight, stopping at every farmhouse and isolated property on the north side of the county. He was not alone in this effort. There were others who tried to help, but none of them had what he had, which was a home that could keep people alive indefinitely on a small amount of fuel, a home whose warmth would not fail. He brought people up, one family at a time, an elderly man who had run out of heating oil, a young mother with 2 small children whose chimney had clogged with ice and whose husband was in the hospital in Duluth unreachable, 3 brothers from a dairy farm whose barn had collapsed under the snow load and whose farmhouse, inadequately insulated, was losing heat faster than their stove could generate it. A retired school teacher who had broken her wrist in a fall on her frozen porch and could no longer carry wood. 9 people in the end. He brought them up the ridge in the blizzard on the second and third day, leading them through the white silence, and the Cachalofen kept all of them warm through 5 days of brutal cold on less wood than a conventional stove would have burned in a single night. Ada paused in her telling. The valley below the ridge had caught the afternoon light and was pale gold in the late October sun, and she looked at it for a while without speaking. Then she said, "Harlan Pruitt was 25 years old. He was the deputy county administrator at the time. Young, ambitious, the kind of ambitious that needs something to stand on. When the blizzard ended and the roads cleared and the county sent vehicles out to check on the outlying residents, they found 9 people alive on Cold Hollow Ridge who should, by any reasonable calculation, have been dead.
The story was significant. The kind of story that traveled. The kind of story that in 1978, in a rural Minnesota county, made the person at the center of it into someone people remembered. Pruitt had understood that immediately. He had arrived at the ridge on the day after the roads cleared with the county vehicles and the relief workers, and in the aftermath, and the relief and the general chaos of people being reunited with their families and their ordinary lives, he had done something so simple and so effective that it had barely been visible. He had talked.
He had told the story to the county commissioners. He had told it to the newspaper. He had told it at the town meeting that February, where the community gathered to assess what had happened and what the county should do differently. He had told it in the first person with the careful omissions and gentle reframings of someone who was not lying outright but was editing the record. In his version, the coordination and the decision-making had been his. He had organized the rescue effort. He had directed the resources. Silas Voss had been a helpful local resident, certainly someone with a warm building who had cooperated with the county's efforts. Silas had not been at the February meeting. He had never attended town meetings. He had no interest in the politics of the valley and had made no effort to insert himself into the narrative as it was being constructed. By the time he understood what was being built on top of what had actually happened, the structure was already complete. Pruitt's version had been printed, filed, cited in the County Emergency Response Review, and absorbed into the official record. Ada's voice was even and dry as she told this, the voice of someone who has processed an anger over a long enough period that it has become something closer to fact. Silas had gone to Pruitt privately. Once. He had told him that the record was incorrect and that he intended to correct it. Pruitt had listened to him with the patience of a man who has already calculated the outcome of a conversation and knows it will go his way. Then he had said simply that no one would believe a man who lived alone on a ridge and had no relationships in the community over a county official with a clean record and the written documentation already in the files. He had been correct, Ada said. That was the most honest part of it. Pruitt had simply been correct. Silas had returned to the ridge and stayed there. He had not tried again. Pruitt had ridden the story of the 1978 rescue through a career in county government, becoming alderman in 1980. A position he had held since his authority rooted in the reputation of a thing he had not done. The story of those 9 people and how they had survived the story of the Cachalofen and the man who had carried strangers through a blizzard on his back had never been told publicly. The 9 people and their families knew the truth. Ada knew the truth. A handful of others knew it. They had stayed silent for 30 years because Pruitt had accumulated enough power quietly and steadily that challenging him was a calculation that most people looked at and set aside. Nora listened to all of this without speaking. When Ada finished, the quality of the silence between them had changed. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have arrived at an understanding that does not need to be restated. He wants the land, Nora said. He's always wanted the land, Ada said.
He doesn't know exactly what Silas found here, but he knows Silas considered it worth protecting, and that's been enough.
Nora thought about the journal, about the thermal mass of the ridge, the specific properties of the stone, the subterranean stability that made this particular spot so unusual. She thought about the key. She had not yet found what it opened. "Why did you come now?" Nora asked. Ada looked at her directly for the first time since she had begun talking. "Because you're still here," she said. "Most people who come up here looking at that ruin turn around. You've been here 3 weeks, and you've built a foundation." She paused. "Silas said you would." Nora returned to her work. Ada sat for another hour on the flat stone, not helping, not hindering, just present in the particular way that certain older people are present as a kind of witness. And then she gathered her bag and picked her way back down the trail without ceremony. She had left the cloth bag on the stone. Inside it was a jar of preserved venison stew, a wedge of hard cheese, and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a hand-drawn map of the property, older than the one in the journal, in a different hand, with annotations she did not recognize as Silas's writing. At the bottom of the map was a name, Eli Cray, and a date, October 1971. Wendell Cray's father. She set it aside and ate the stew cold and went back to the stone. Wendell Cray came up the hill for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, 7 days after Ada's visit. He appeared at the edge of the work site without announcement, having apparently left his truck at the junction and walked the 6 miles up in the time it took her to notice the quality of the afternoon light had changed. He stood and looked at what she had built. The lower section of the Cachalofen was complete 3 feet of precisely laid soapstone. Rising from the foundation, she had poured the firebox formed and the first flue passage integrated. The structure had begun to take on the presence of something permanent. It no longer looked like construction. It looked like it had always been there and was simply being uncovered. Wendell said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You did this alone?" "Yes." He walked around it slowly, examining the mortar joints, crouching to look at the firebox opening, running a thumb along the edge of a soapstone face. "This is your father's stone," Nora said. She had not planned to say it, but it was there. Wendell went still. She picked up the map Ada had left and held it out. He took it and looked at it, and his face did what faces do when they encounter something unexpected in a landscape they thought they knew entirely. A kind of stillness followed by a slow rearrangement. "He never said," Wendell said. "Maybe he had reasons." Wendell folded the map carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He stood for a while longer, looking at the stove. Then he said, "I'll be up Tuesdays. I'll bring what I can." He walked back down the hill. He came back the following Tuesday with a wheelbarrow which had not been on any supply list she had given him, and 3 cases of canned provisions, and he left them at the work site without comment, and without expecting comment in return. He came back the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. He never helped with the construction directly. That was not what she needed from him, and he understood this without being told, which told her a great deal about him. What she needed from him was the evidence that someone in the valley knew she was up here and would notice if she stopped being up here. That was not a small thing. That was in certain specific conditions, everything. The stove rose, course by course, flue passage by flue passage. The soapstone mass climbed the back wall of the rebuilt dugout, integrating with the chimney that Silas had originally constructed and that she had repaired and reinforced in the early days of her work. Each new course required the clay mortar to cure before the next was laid, and she used those waiting hours to continue the reconstruction of the dugout's front wall, setting the fieldstone with cement, leaving the precise openings for the low door and the single deep-set window that Silas's design specified. The window faced south. This was not accidental. Silas had noted the angle of winter sun at this latitude in December, and January low and direct through a south-facing opening, contributing measurable solar gain to the thermal budget of the space. Every element of the design was in conversation with every other element. She understood this more completely with every hour she worked. She was building a system, not a structure. Pruitt came back in mid-November. He did not come up the ridge this time. He sent someone, a young man from the county planning office she had never seen before, who arrived at the bottom of the trail in a county vehicle and called up to her through the trees. She descended to meet him, and he handed her a document with the Flint County seal on the cover and an expression of deliberate neutrality that told her he found his errand distasteful. The document was a formal inquiry into the title status of the Cold Hollow Ridge property. It raised questions about the legal capacity of Silas Voss to have executed a valid will, citing his long-standing isolation and lack of contact with the county as evidence of possible mental incapacity. It requested a response within 30 days. She read it at the work site that evening. Then she opened the journal to a section near the back, one she had read through quickly before, but now went through carefully, a section titled in Silas's compressed hand, simply Records. He had kept records. He had kept 37 years of property tax receipts organized by year. He had kept correspondence with the county assessor's office with a Granger attorney named Hargreaves, who had handled the original title work with a Duluth physician who had seen him annually. He had kept in a separate envelope that she found tucked into the journal's back cover a copy of his will, notarized in 2006 by the same attorney, with a cover letter that addressed the question of capacity directly and preemptively, referencing 2 doctors' assessments and 3 character statements from people in the valley who had done business with him over the years. He had anticipated this. He had built his defense before the attack came, the way he had built his house before the blizzard came, on the principle that the time to prepare for what is coming is before it arrives. She put the documents in the waterproof sleeve she had made from the oilskin remnants and set them aside. She went back to the stone. The sky on the last day of November was the color of pewter, and the air had changed. She had been feeling the change for 3 days, a deepening in the cold that was different from the ordinary cold of autumn's end, a cold with intention behind it, dense and purposeful, moving down from the north with the particular patience of something that has all the time in the world. She was on the third to last course of the stove's upper thermal mass.
She worked through that day without stopping for anything except water and a handful of walnuts from the bag Wendell had brought. She worked until her hands could no longer feel the stones individually and had to be warmed against her body every 20 minutes to remain functional. She worked by the light of the lantern when the day failed, the shadows of the rising stove moving large on the rebuilt walls around her. The wind had found its voice again by midnight.
By the early hours of the morning, the temperature outside had dropped below zero, and the wind was not gusting, but sustained a continuous roar across the ridge top. That was not weather exactly. It was the ridge itself expressing something a long declaration in a language made entirely of pressure and cold. She laid the final capstone of the upper thermal mass at 2 a.m. by lantern light, pressing it into the mortar bed and checking it level with the small bubble level she had found in a box of Silas's tools buried in the floor debris. Level. The mortar had the right consistency, holding without cracking at the joint edges. She sat back on the floor of the dugout and looked at it.
It was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was not trying to be. It was a mass of gray-green stone rising from floor to ceiling against the back wall 7 feet at its highest, integrated with the chimney above. It was dense and final and present in the way that things built to last are present with the weight of intention made solid. The firebox opening was low a foot above the floor, protected by the iron door she had salvaged and refit with new fire clay packing.
She laid the first fire. Silas had been specific about this, not large. The first fire should be small and hot, using dry hardwood in pieces no larger than her wrist, with all the airflow dampers fully open, burning fast and complete. This was not to heat the space, but to cure the remaining moisture from the mortar and begin the long initial seasoning of the soapstone mass. He had written, "The first firing is not for warmth. It is an introduction. You are telling the stone what it is for." She used the last of the dry hardwood she had saved for this. The fire caught immediately the draft, pulling perfectly through the firebox and into the first flue passage as it should, the roar of combustion muffled by the iron door into a low, steady pulse. She closed the damper to the correct position and listened. The sound changed. The roar deepened and slowed into something more like a breath, and then into something beneath sound, a vibration she felt in the floor rather than heard with her ears. The fire was doing its designed work, moving through the internal passages, distributing itself into the mass. She put her palm flat against the side of the stove and felt nothing but cold stone. That was correct. The stone would not be warm for hours. The process was not instant. It was patient. It was slow and certain and could not be rushed. And when it was done, when the mass had received all it could hold, it would begin to give back steadily for hours beyond the life of the fire itself. She put on every layer she had and lay down on her bedroll and listened to the wind outside. The wind outside was the end of the world. Down in the valley of Flint County, in the town of Granger, lights were going out one by one as the storm hit the power lines, and the power lines made the decisions that power lines make in those conditions. In his large house with its inefficient rooms and its cast iron stove fed by a cord of split oak, Harlan Pruitt was adding wood at a rate that, if maintained, would exhaust his supply before the storm's end. The heat from his stove radiated in a 6-foot sphere and lost the argument with the cold everywhere beyond that perimeter. He was running on brute force, and the brute force was losing. On the ridge inside 4 feet of stone and earth and 37 years of applied intelligence, Nora Voss lay still and felt the temperature in the dugout stop falling. It was not warm yet, but it had stopped falling. She put her hand flat on the floor beside her. The earth below gave back what it knew the accumulated temperature of a season, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the worst cold. A floor beneath the cold, a memory of what the ground had been in August and September, when the sun had driven its heat down into the mineral dark, and the stone had received it and kept it. The wind screamed over the ridge. The stone received the wind's sound and absorbed it and returned it as silence. She closed her eyes. Outside, the white silence had arrived exactly as Silas Voss had said it would, exactly as he had built his entire life on this ridge to meet. It came down from the north without mercy and without apology, and covered everything with the absolute democracy of its cold, the houses and the fields and the county roads and the large house of a man who had built his reputation on a lie and his comfort on a cord of wood that was running out. She was not fighting it. She was not even in it. She was in the memory of a fire held in the arms of stone, and the stone did not forget. Cold ground deep roots. Part 3. What the Stone Remembers. The blizzard lasted 4 days. She knew this not by watching it, because there was nothing to watch from inside the dugout, except the small window's rectangle of absolute white. But by the rhythm of it, the way the wind's voice changed over those 4 days from a scream to a sustained roar, to a low, exhausted moan, the way a fever moves through its stages before it breaks. She had lived through enough difficult things to recognize the shape of endurance, the long middle section, where nothing seems to be changing, but everything is slowly at the cellular level. Until one morning, the quality of the light is different, and you understand that the worst has passed. She ate, she slept, she read. The cachalophon performed exactly as Silas Voss had designed it to perform. She refired it once on the second day, using a modest amount of wood, following the instructions in the journal for sustained operation during extended cold events. The process took 2 hours from lighting to the point where she could close the damper and let the mass take over again. By the 3rd day, she understood the stove's rhythms well enough that she could judge the residual heat in the stone by touch and know without looking at any instrument whether a refiring was needed or whether the mass still held enough to carry the space through another cycle.
The temperature inside the dugout remained through all 4 days of the worst blizzard in a generation within a range that was not merely survivable, but genuinely comfortable. Not warm the way an overheated room is warm, not the aggressive dry heat of an iron stove pushed to its limit, but warm the way a living thing is warm from the inside out, steady and even with no cold corners and no drafts and no sudden failures. The stone floor held its temperature. The earthen walls behind the stone facing held their temperature. The south-facing window shuttered, but not sealed, admitted a thin thread of diffuse light, even through the whiteout, enough to read by if she sat close. She read the journal from the beginning again.
Not the technical sections this time, not the diagrams and specifications that had consumed her attention over the previous weeks, but the earlier portions, the sections before the engineering, the ones she had moved through quickly in those first cold days, because the practical urgency of the work had pulled her forward. She read them now with the particular quality of attention that comes when the immediate crisis has resolved and the mind can afford to settle into something.
Silas Voss had been born in 1944 in the same county where he died. He had grown up on a working farm outside of Granger, the kind of farm that was its own economy, that produced most of what it consumed and sold the margin. He had been the kind of child who took things apart to understand them and could usually put them back together, who found the mechanisms of the world more interesting than the social arrangements that governed access to those mechanisms. He had gone to the State College in 1962 on a scholarship, studied mechanical and civil engineering, graduated in 1966, taken a position with a firm in Minneapolis.
He had lasted there for 2 years. The journal described those 2 years with a brevity that communicated more than length could have. The work was fine, he wrote. The problem was everything around the work. The meetings, the hierarchies, the slow grinding of individual intelligence against the institutional preference for consensus and caution. He had been good at his job, and had known he was good at his job, and had made the error of allowing that knowledge to be visible, which had not gone over well with certain people above him. He had come back to Flint County in 1968 and bought the ridge land with the savings he had accumulated and the specific intention of being left alone to think. He had not expected to stay forever. He had expected, in the way that young men expect things, that he would stay a few years, get the system out of his system, and return to some version of professional life with a clearer sense of what he wanted from it. But the ridge had its own intentions. The problems it presented were more interesting than the ones the engineering firm had offered him, more honest, more immediate in their consequences, and the solutions he developed were completely his own. There was no committee. There was no review process. There was only the cold and the stone and the question of how to live. The 1978 blizzard had not been a surprise to him. He had written about it before it happened in a passage dated January 3rd of that year, 2 weeks before the storm. There is a pressure drop in the atmosphere that has been building for 6 days.
The behavior of the animals in the upper timber has changed. The tree bark on the north-facing birches is unusually thick this year, which the old farmers used to read as a sign of a hard winter to come, and I have come to believe they were right to read it. I am preparing for something large.
He had been ready. She set the journal down on the morning of the 4th day and lay on her back on the bedroll and looked at the ceiling of the dugout, which was low and roughly plastered, and in one corner showed the faint, dark bloom of moisture from a crack she had identified and repaired weeks ago. The crack had held through the storm. She looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who has fixed a thing correctly and then watched the fix be tested. The wind, which had been a continuous presence for 4 days, had dropped to nothing sometime in the early morning hours. The silence was so complete after that sustained roar that it had a quality almost like sound, the silence of a held breath. The silence after the last note of something very long. She rose and went to the door. She lifted the bar and pulled. The door opened inward against a wall of compressed snow that had drifted up against the exterior face of the front wall to a depth of nearly 4 feet. She looked at it for a moment, then went back for the flat spade and began to clear it methodically from the inside out, working the snow back and to the side until she had carved a channel wide enough to step through, and then she stepped through. The world was white and still and enormous. The storm had deposited more snow than she had an instinct for. It had remade the ridge entirely, softening every hard edge, filling every depression, racing the evidence of her weeks of labor under a smooth, unmarked surface that gave nothing away. The morning sky above was a blue so deep and clear it seemed to have been washed of everything that was not itself. The sun was low, and the light it cast across the snow was nearly horizontal, throwing long blue shadows from every small irregularity in the surface, and the whole landscape glittered with the cold fire of ice crystals catching the lights. She stood in the channel she had dug and looked at it. She had no language for what she felt that was adequate to it. It was not triumph exactly. It was closer to something she had read once in a book she had found in a group home common room years ago. A word from a language other than English that described the feeling of having passed through something very difficult and arrived on the other side, not unscathed, but intact. She was intact. The stove was burning behind her. The dugout was warm. Silas Voss had built her a way to survive, and she had survived, and the snow lay over the ridge in its vast indifference, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She took a long breath of the cold air and went back inside to eat breakfast. She was heating the stew when she heard them. Footsteps. Multiple sets moving slowly. And with great effort, the specific sound of someone moving through deep snow with the labored rhythm of exhaustion. She put down the pan and listened. They were coming up the trail, which meant they had come from the valley, which meant they had climbed 6 miles through 4 feet of snow on a trail that was now entirely unmarked.
She picked up the flat spade and went to the door. Wendell Cray appeared at the top of the trail first. He was wearing snowshoes she did not recognize, old ones, the wooden-framed traditional style laced with what looked like rawhide, and he was carrying a long-handled shovel over one shoulder. His face was the color of someone who has been in extreme cold for several hours, the deep red of capillaries working at maximum effort. And there was frost in his eyebrows and on the scarf wrapped around his lower face. He was moving with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it regardless of what the doing costs. Behind him, at a distance of perhaps 20 yards, came Ada Coombs. She was moving more slowly, but she was moving each step placed with the care of someone who has been around long enough to understand that a fall in these conditions is not a minor inconvenience. She had a cloth bag over her shoulder that she had apparently carried the entire 6 miles up from the junction. They had not come together. Nora understood. They had arrived at the same moment by separate decisions made for separate reasons, and the coincidence of their timing felt less like coincidence than like the natural convergence of people moving toward the same point. Wendell reached the cleared channel and stopped. He looked at it. Then he looked at the stone chimney from which a nearly invisible shimmer of heat haze rose into the cold blue air, the faintest possible breath of warmth against the infinite cold. His eyes moved to it and stayed. He had come, she understood, with the shovel, because he had expected to dig. He stood looking at the heat haze above the chimney for a long moment, and something moved across his face that was not any single emotion, but the passage of several in sequence relief. And then something more complicated, the specific expression of a person who has revised a fundamental assumption and is in the process of accommodating the revision. He said, "You're warm." His voice was rough from cold and exertion and something else. "Come in," she said. He had to duck to clear the low lintel of the door. Inside, the warmth received him the way warmth receives someone who has been very cold, as a physical presence, palpable and immediate. And she watched him stop just inside the door and stand still for a moment with his eyes closed, the way people stand in the first moments of something they did not expect and need a second to believe. He opened his eyes and looked at the cockalophon. It occupied the back wall, the way a mountain occupies a landscape, not aggressively, but absolutely, as though it had always been there, and everything built around it had been arranged in relation to it. The soapstone face was warm to the touch, slightly above body temperature, radiating its deep and patient heat into every corner of the small space. In the single south-facing window, the morning light fell across the stone floor in a long rectangle. Wendell set his shovel against the wall and walked slowly to the stove and put his hand flat against its surface. He held it there. She watched him look at the stone under his palm, and she saw the moment when he registered the sensation of it. Not just the warmth, but the specific quality of it, steady and deep. Not the surface heat of something burning, but the stored warmth of something that had received heat hours ago and had been releasing it ever since patiently, without instruction, because that was the nature of the material. He said, "My father worked this stone." It was not a question. He had had 4 days to think about the map Ada had brought him, and he had thought about it in the way that a man who does not speak much thinks about things thoroughly and without distraction until he had arrived at the understanding rather than the question. "Yes," she said. "He never said. In all the years I knew him, he never once said he had been up here." "He had reasons not to." Wendell nodded slowly. He was still touching the stone. "I know about Pruitt," he said. "What he did to Silas, what he took from him." He paused. "My father told me when I was old enough to hear it. He told me what really happened in 1978. He told me never to repeat it while Pruitt was in office because Pruitt had reach and my father had a business to protect and a family." He took his hand from the stone and turned to look at her. "He said the truth would outlast the man. I never knew what that meant until now." Ada came through the door behind them, moving carefully over the threshold, and straightened up inside and looked around the space with the unhurried attention of someone returning to a place they have thought about for a long time. She put her cloth bag on the table. She did not say anything about the warmth or the stove. She looked at these things and she nodded once to herself, the nod of someone checking an item from a list they have been carrying for years. Then she sat down and she said, "Pruitt's house is ruined. Pipes burst on the 2nd day. He burned through everything he had by the 3rd day. Last I heard, before the roads closed, he was at the county emergency shelter in Granger with 40 other people." She said it without satisfaction, or rather, with the kind of satisfaction that is so old it has become indistinguishable from fact. Nora heated the stew and they ate together in the warm space. The 3 of them, while outside, the sun moved across the enormous white sky, and the ridge held its silence. The story came down from the mountain the way water comes down after a thaw, following the natural channels, finding the low places, arriving in the valley without announcement, and spreading from there. Wendell Cray carried the essential facts in his flat and credible voice, and the flat credibility of it was more persuasive than any elaboration could have been. He told people what he had found when he climbed Cold Hollow Ridge with a shovel and a reasonable expectation of having to use it. He told them about the heat haze above the chimney, visible in the blue post-storm air from 100 yards away. He told them about the warmth inside the dugout and the stove that had maintained it through 4 days of the worst cold in 30 years. On a quantity of fuel that he named specifically, because the specific quantity was the part that people could not initially process and so needed to hear more than once. He told them about the stone. He did not editorialize. He did not frame it as miracle or wonder. He described what he had observed with the precision of a man who handles material realities every day and knows how to report them accurately, and that precision was what made it land the way it landed. People listened.
They had been cold. They had run their supplies down and burned through their reserves and spent 4 days in a contest with the temperature that many of them had not entirely won. The contrast between that experience and what Wendell described from the ridge was not abstract. It was personal. It was the difference between their last 4 days and someone else's last 4 days, and that difference required explanation. The explanation was Silas Voss. His name moved through the community the way names move when they have been suppressed for a long time and the suppression finally fails. Not gradually, but all at once released by the specific pressure of events that make the true story more necessary than the convenient one. People remembered. Not everyone and not in detail, but enough, and the details that were remembered were consistent in the ways that true accounts are consistent. The small specific things that invention does not typically bother to include. The color of the blanket he had wrapped around the Henderson children when he carried them up the trail. The particular soup he had made from what he had available venison and dried beans that the retired schoolteacher, Mrs. Fairweather, had said was the best meal of her life, despite or because of the circumstances. The sound of the cachalophin on the first night, the deep, subsonic pulse of it that the elderly Reuben Marsh had described to his son as sounding like the earth breathing. These details had been kept quietly in the private memories of the people who had been there and their families for 30 years. They had not been spoken publicly because there had been no occasion that made speaking them safe, and now there was. Pruitt was aware of the shift. He returned to his damaged house when the roads cleared, and he began the process of repair and restoration with the efficiency of a man who understands that visible damage to his property is visible damage to his authority. And he moved through the community in the aftermath of the storm with the careful energy of someone who senses the ground moving under them and is trying to step lightly. He was at every community meeting. He was visible at the grain elevator and the diner and the county building. He talked about the community's resilience. He talked about the county's emergency response. He did not talk about Cold Hollow Ridge. 3 weeks after the storm, his office filed the next step in the legal challenge to Silas Voss's will, escalating the capacity question to a formal petition for probate review by the county court. The document was longer and more technical than the first inquiry, and it named Harlan Pruitt as an interested party with a claim on the property based on an alleged verbal agreement with Silas Voss that he was now prepared to assert had constituted a binding commitment to sell. Nora read the document at the worksite standing in the winter light. She was not afraid of it. She understood it for what it was, the last move of a man who has run out of patience and has decided that direct force is preferable to continued waiting. He had watched her survive the storm, had felt the shift in the community's perception, had understood that time was no longer on his side, and he had moved. She put the document in the waterproof sleeve with the others and went back to the stone. She had a secondary structure to build, a small addition to the east side of the dugout, another room, modest, just enough space for a second person to sleep and work with its own connection to the main thermal mass of the cachalophin.
Silas had designed it as an option in the original plans, noting its possibility without insisting on it writing in the margin. When the time comes that this is necessary, the foundation footing is already in place. You only need to build up. She had discovered the footing when she was doing the initial excavation. She had not known what it was then. Now she did. She was building up. The probate hearing was scheduled for the second week of January in the Flint County Courthouse in the larger town of Mill Haven, 14 miles from Granger. Nora received the notice by mail, the envelope addressed to the Cold Hollow Ridge property, in a hand she did not recognize, delivered to a mail drop in Granger that she had established the previous fall. She went down to Granger 3 days before the hearing to see the attorney whose name appeared in Silas's records, a man named Hargreaves, who had an office above the feed supply and who received her without an appointment, which told her that he had been expecting her at some point. Hargreaves was a small, thin man in his late 60s, with the careful precision of someone who has spent a lifetime working with language as a load-bearing material and has developed a professional's respect for its structural properties. He had the documents that Silas had prepared and sent to him, the complete records package, the tax receipts, the medical assessments, the notarized will, the character statements. He had also, he told her, received a communication from Ada Coombs the previous week. Ada had asked him a question about legal procedure. Specifically, she had asked him about the admissibility of witness testimony at a probate hearing and the weight accorded to multiple witnesses speaking to the same factual matter. He said he had answered her question fully. He said, with the specific restraint of a man who is managing his professional neutrality carefully, that he looked forward to seeing how the hearing developed. The Flint County Courthouse was a building from 1904 brick and stone, with the proportional dignity of a generation that built public structures to outlast its own ambitions. The hearing room was on the second floor, high-ceilinged and cold in January, the heating system inadequate to the volume of space and the temperature outside. Nora arrived early and sat in the second row. Pruitt arrived with his attorney, a man from Mill Haven, who wore a suit that communicated the distance between his professional context and this room, and they sat at the petitioner's table and arranged their documents and spoke quietly to each other in the manner of people who have assessed the situation and find it manageable. The county probate judge was a woman named Garfield, practical-faced and unhurried, who had heard a great many things in this room over the years, and whose expression suggested she was prepared to hear several more before forming a view. The hearing opened with Pruitt's attorney presenting the petition, citing the evidence for incapacity. Silas Voss's 37 years of voluntary isolation, his lack of engagement with county services, his failure to maintain relationships with banking institutions or government programs, all offered as evidence of a man whose grip on ordinary reality had been sufficiently compromised that his testamentary decisions could not be taken as reliable. Hargreaves responded with the records, the 37 years of property tax payments on time and in full, the medical documentation, the notarized will with its embedded capacity assessment. The attorney who had prepared the will, who was present and prepared to testify, did testify, describing a man who had been precise, organized, and entirely clear in his instructions, and who had anticipated and addressed the capacity question directly in his preparation of the document. Pruitt's attorney countered that self-prepared documentation and the testimony of a paid professional were insufficient to establish the quality of judgment required, and that the alleged verbal agreement between his client and the deceased regarding the eventual disposition of the property deserved consideration. Judge Garfield looked up from her papers and asked Pruitt's attorney if he had any written evidence of this alleged agreement. He said the verbal nature of the agreement was its character. She looked at him for a moment and then made a note. It was at this point that Ada Coombs stood up from the gallery. She did not ask permission exactly. She rose with the calm authority of someone who has decided that the ordinary protocols of a situation are adequate to her purposes, and she intends to use them, and she said in a voice that carried without effort to every corner of the high-ceilinged room, "Your Honor, I have a request for the court." Judge Garfield looked at her over her reading glasses. Ada said, "There are people in this room who have direct knowledge of facts material to this matter. I am requesting that the court hear testimony." Pruitt's attorney began to object on procedural grounds, and Garfield raised one hand, a minimal gesture, and he stopped. She asked Ada how many people she was referring to. Ada said 9. There was a quality to the silence that followed that was different from the ordinary silence of a courtroom pause. It was the silence of a room in which something has changed, in which the weight distribution has shifted, and everyone present can feel the shift, but has not yet fully processed its meaning. Nora in the second row did not turn around. She had known in a general way that Ada had been making preparations. She had not known the specific form those preparations had taken. She sat still and looked at the front of the room and felt the quality of the silence change around her. Judge Garfield said she would hear the testimony. They came forward one by one. Not all of them were old enough to have been there themselves. 2 were the children of people who had since died, speaking to what their parents had told them, which was admissible as evidence of community knowledge, if not as direct testimony. But 4 of the 9 had been there, had been in the storm, had been brought up the ridge, had been kept warm and fed for 5 days in a structure built by a man they had known their entire lives, and whose name had been removed from the record of those events by a different man whose name had replaced it. They spoke with the particular quality of people who have been waiting a long time to say something true out loud. An older man named Calvin Marsh, who had been 19 in 1978 and was now in his late 40s, described being carried piggyback up the trail by Silas Voss when his own feet had gone beyond cold to the early stages of frostbite, and how Silas had said almost nothing. The entire climb had simply carried him steadily, one step at a time, in the dark and the blowing snow all the way to the top. A woman in her mid-60s named Dorothea Ellison, who had been the young mother with 2 children, described the dugout as it had been that first night, warm and lit by a single lantern, with Silas sitting in the corner, reading a technical manual as if having several near-frozen strangers arrive at his home in a blizzard was an expected variation on his ordinary evening.
She said, "He never asked for anything in return. Not thanks, not money, not acknowledgement. He said the stove worked best when it was sharing what it had and that people were the same. I have thought about that for 30 years.
Harlan Pruitt sat at the petitioner's table and did not move and did not speak. His attorney made 2 further attempts to intervene on procedural grounds and was twice declined by Judge Garfield, whose expression had moved from neutrality to something that was not quite judgment, but was adjacent to it. The 9th witness was Wendell Cray.
He spoke last, and he spoke briefly in the way that he did everything without excess.
He described his father, Eli Cray, and the autumn of 1971, when a man living alone on the North Ridge had contracted with him for help quarrying soapstone from the outcropping on his property. He described his father's account of that work, weeks of labor alongside Silas Voss in service of a design that Eli Cray had not fully understood at the time, but had executed with the skill of his craft because the specifications were precise, and the man giving them knew exactly what he was building.
He said,
"My father told me he never worked with anyone who was more certain of what they were making or why. He said the man was building something to last, not for himself, for whoever came after." He said he was right. Judge Garfield suspended the hearing for 30 minutes. When she returned, she denied the petition. She denied it on the grounds that the documentation of Silas Voss's competence was comprehensive and credible, and that the petitioner had offered no evidence of the alleged verbal agreement beyond assertion. She noted, without elaborating, that the testimony heard that morning had been material to her understanding of the character and judgment of the deceased, and that it reflected well on both. Pruitt's attorney announced an intention to appeal. Garfield said that was his client's right. Pruitt stood and buttoned his coat and walked out of the courtroom with the careful walk of a man carrying something heavy and not wanting anyone to see the effort it was costing him. His attorney followed. In the gallery, the 9 witnesses and their families did not celebrate. There was no noise, no visible relief. There was a settling, a collective breath released slowly the physical expression of a weight that has been carried for a long time, being gently at last set down. Ada Coombs put on her coat and came to where Nora was sitting. She did not say anything. She put her hand briefly on Nora's shoulder, a gesture so simple it required no interpretation, and then she walked out. Nora sat alone in the emptying courtroom for a while. She thought about Silas Voss, who had sat alone on a ridge for 37 years with the truth of 1978, and had made the choice over and over, not to fight it, but to build around it, to build something that would outlast the lie and outlast the man who had told it. She thought about the journal and the letter and the 15 years of careful, invisible protection. She thought about what it cost to live that way, to hold that kind of patience, to trust that the stone remembers long after the fire is out. She thought it must have been very lonely. She thought that the loneliness was also a kind of love, the love of a man who had nothing to offer except what he had built,
and the knowledge of how to use it. Outside, Millhaven was cold and bright, and entirely indifferent to the proceeding that had just concluded in the room above its main street. People moved along the sidewalk in their winter coats with their ordinary purposes. A truck moved through the intersection at the end of the block. Somewhere, a dog was barking at something it considered significant. She walked to where she had left the truck she had borrowed from Wendell, and she drove back to Granger, and then she walked the 6 miles up the trail in the afternoon light. The appeal took 4 months and failed.
Pruitt's attorney filed twice more on procedural grounds over the following year, and both filings were dismissed. By the second year, the filings had stopped. By the third year, Pruitt had resigned his position as alderman, citing health reasons, and had moved to a town in a different county, where nobody knew him as anything other than a man in a pressed coat who lived alone and did not speak much about his past. Nobody in Flint County missed him.
What they missed, or rather what they found they had been missing without knowing it, was harder to name. It was not a person exactly. It was more like a quality of relationship with the land they lived on and the winters they endured, a knowledge that had been present in the community once and had gone quiet when the man who held it had gone quiet. And that was now slowly and practically being recovered. Nora began teaching in the spring of the second year.
It was not a formal arrangement.
She did not advertise. She simply told Wendell that she was willing to show people how to build. And Wendell told a few people, and those people told a few more. And on a Saturday morning in April, she found 6 individuals standing at the edge of the work site on Cold Hollow Ridge with questions, and in 2 cases, notebooks.
She showed them the journal. She translated the technical language into the practical, the way a good teacher translates not just the words, but the underlying logic, so that the student leaves with not just an instruction, but an understanding that can be applied to the variations that actual conditions always produce. She showed them the soapstone deposit. She showed them the clay. She showed them the foundation of the second room now complete, and the addition she had begun beyond it, a small workshop space where she had been experimenting with the variations on Silas's basic design modifications for different space volumes, adaptations for existing structures with less ideal geometries. They came back the following Saturday and the one after that.
By summer, there were 12 of them, and by autumn, there were people in 3 households in the outlying areas of the county who had built their own variations on the Cachalofin and were preparing to test them against the coming winter with the specific quality of confidence that comes not from certainty of outcome, but from understanding of principle. They understood what they were doing. That was the difference. They were not following instructions the way you follow a recipe, hoping the result matches the description. They understood the principle behind each step, the why beneath the what, and that understanding meant they could adapt, could solve the small problems that arose in every real-world application, could look at an unexpected result and reason backward to its cause.
Silas Voss had understood this.
He had built it into the journal from the beginning, had written not just what to do, but why had trusted the reader to be capable of receiving not just instruction, but education. Wendell Cray came up the ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the 2nd October, and stood at the edge of the work site and watched a group of 4 people working on a practice structure under Nora's direction. She was not demonstrating. She was watching them work and asking questions, the kind of questions that a good teacher asks. Questions that the student answers by thinking rather than by remembering. He stood there for a while. When the session ended and the group began to descend the trail, Wendell walked to where Nora was stacking tools in the lean-to she had built against the east wall. He said, "Your uncle would have approved of this." She considered the statement. "He did approve of it," she said. "He built it to happen." Wendell thought about that. He looked at the Cachalofin chimney above the dugout roof, breathing its faint, nearly invisible warmth into the October air. He looked at the ridge and the valley below, and the sky above the ridge that was moving toward the particular gray-blue of late afternoon in autumn, the color that meant the temperature would drop sharply after dark, and the animals in the upper timber would be settling in for the night with the pragmatic thoroughness of creatures who know exactly what is coming. He said, "Winter soon." "Yes," she said. She was not afraid of it. This was not bravado or performance or the specific stubbornness of someone who has proved something and needs to keep proving it. It was something simpler and more durable than any of those things. It was knowledge, the deep-bone knowledge of someone who has learned not just how to survive a thing, but why the survival is possible. What principle underlies it? What will hold when everything else is variable? The cold was not the enemy. It never had been. The cold was simply the condition, the given the fixed term of existence in this place. The question was never how to defeat it, but how to understand it well enough to live within it, to find the still point at the center of its motion, the warmth that persisted not by fighting the cold, but by remembering in stone and earth and carefully tended fire everything that warmth had ever been. Ada Coombs came up the trail as the light was going. She came once a week now in good weather and in marginal weather, and in one memorable instance the previous winter in weather that Wendell had described afterward as frankly inadvisable, though he had said it in the tone of a man who found the inadvisability admirable. She brought food, and she sat by the stove, and she talked, or didn't talk, according to the mood and the hour. She was the only person who had known Silas Voss as a young man, and who could speak of him as a full person rather than a legend, with his flaws and his silences, and his particular way of laughing at something he found genuinely funny, which was apparently very sudden and somewhat alarming if you were not prepared for it. She talked about him the way you talk about someone who is gone, but not absent, someone whose presence has changed form, but not ended, who has become part of the landscape, rather than separate from it. Nora listened to these accounts,
with the specific hunger of someone who has spent a long time not having a family and is now carefully piece by piece assembling one from the materials available. It was not the family she might have imagined at 7 years old, in the back seat of a county vehicle, moving away from everything familiar, if she had been able to imagine anything at all. It was not conventional in any sense. It was a ridge in northern Minnesota, and a woman who came once a week with food and stories, and a man who came on Tuesdays with supplies and stayed longer each time, and a group of people who came on Saturdays with notebooks, and the accumulated knowledge of a man she had never met, who had nevertheless spent the better part of his life making sure she would be all right.
It was not nothing. It was, she understood now, in the way you understand something that has been true for a long time before you find the words for it, the precise opposite of nothing. On a clear evening in late October, with the first light snow of the season beginning to fall in small experimental flakes that drifted more than they fell, settling on the ridge without conviction, she sat by the cachalofen with the journal in her lap, and she opened it to the first page. She read the letter again. She had read it many times by then. She knew the words well enough to recite them, but reading it was not about the words anymore. It was about the voice behind the words, the specific quality of attention that a person puts into something written for one reader. The knowledge that this was made for her, with her in mind, by a man who had thought about her for a long time. She reached the last line.
Silas Voss had written, "You do not need me anymore. You never did. I only needed to make sure you knew that." She sat with that for a while. Outside, the snow was beginning to commit. The flakes were coming down with more intention now, less drift and more fall, and the ridge was going white at the edges, and somewhere in the upper timber, a branch released its accumulated weight with a soft percussion, and the silence closed back over it immediately. The cachalofen radiated its patient warmth into every corner of the room. The stone remembered.